The year 1859 was a dry one, even for the New Mexico territory. The wind, a constant resident of Sagebrush Bend, carried more dust than promise. It scoured the life from the land, leaving behind a palette of brown and gray. The town itself was little more than a collection of weary, wooden and adobe buildings huddled together as if for warmth. Pressed between the stony, sun-baked hills of Ash Mesa and the fickle Bitter Willow River. The river was the town's lifeline and its most accomplished liar, running full and hopeful one season, then shrinking to a muddy trickle the next. A cruel joke whispered through cracked earth. The sun was not a gentle giver of life here. It was a hammer, beating down on the flat roofs in the single dusty street, bleaching the spirit from anything that stood still for too long. On the outskirts of this parched settlement, where the town gave way to the vast, lonely expanse of the desert, was Harlan Pike's ranch. The place was a study in silence. The wind moaned around the corners of the small, sturdy house he had built with his own hands, and the cottonwood trees by the dry creek bed rattled their leaves like old bones. But these were the sounds of emptiness, not life. 3 years had passed since the drought had taken everything from him. Not the ranch, not the horses, but the sounds that had made the silence bearable, the humming of his wife, Sarah, as she mended clothes by the window, the boisterous laughter of his son, Daniel, chasing chickens in the yard. Now, the silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered memory and hope alike. Harlan lived with his horses in the quiet. The animals were his only real confidants. He understood the language of their nickers and snorts, the twitch of their ears, the trust in their large, dark eyes. They were honest creatures in a world that had proven to be anything but. His days were a ritual of work, a rhythm of mending fences, brushing down coats, and staring out at the horizon. A man slowly turning to stone in the relentless sun. In the center of town, inside the dim, cool interior of the post office, Mara Ellison lived a different kind of quiet life. Hers was a silence of walls and windows, of sorting letters addressed to lives she would never lead, sent from places she would never see. Her world smelled of ink and old paper and the fine dust that seeped through the window frames no matter how often she swept. She was a fixture in Sagebrush Bend, as much a part of the landscape as the weathered saloon sign or the empty water trough, yet she remained apart from it. Her interactions were brief, transactional, a parcel weighed, a stamp sold, a polite nod. Her one small, defining gesture was the way she bound her thick, dark hair. She did not use a ribbon or a pin, but a strip of worn, cracked leather, looped and tied at the nape of her neck. It was the remnant of a belt, her mother's, the only thing of substance she had left of her. It was an anchor, a constant, gentle pressure that reminded her of who she was and what she had lost. A silent admonition to expect little and to hold tightly to what was hers. She saw the town through the brass grill of her counter, a world of comings and goings, of loud talk and quiet desperation. And she remained in her small cage of duty, an observer of a life she never felt a part of. Lately, however, a new sound had begun to disturb the town's weary quiet. It was a whisper, a rumor that traveled faster than the mail. The railroad was coming. The words themselves held a kind of magic, a promise of connection to a world beyond the dust and the heat. But for the people of Sagebrush Bend, it meant something far more immediate and tangible. The land, the vast, unforgiving tracts of it that stretched out from the Bitter Willow, was suddenly valuable. It was no longer just a place to scratch out a living. It was a commodity, a prize to be won. And where there was a prize, there were always men who came to claim it. The hub of this new nervous energy was the Lantern Room, the town's only saloon. By late afternoon, it was thick with the smell of cheap spirits, sweat, and simmering greed. Men who had spent years complaining about the worthless soil now spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. At the center of these whispers was a name, Horace Bellamy. He was a land agent, a man who had arrived from the east, dressed in a fine coat that seemed to repel the dust. He spoke of progress and prosperity, but his eyes held the cold glint of a businessman calculating his profits. He was making offers, cash offers, for deeds and water rights, and his contracts were filled with complicated words that few of the ranchers and farmers understood. He preyed on their desperation, on the memory of the last drought, on the fear of the next one. He was a vulture circling a sick animal, and the whole town knew it. But the lure of his silver dollars was a powerful medicine against a weak conscience. Harlan Pike had run out of salt. It was a simple, domestic fact, but it was enough to force him from the sanctuary of his ranch. He saddled his steadiest mare, a buckskin named Dust Devil, and rode toward the town he so often avoided. From a distance, Sagebrush Bend looked like a mistake, a handful of scattered teeth in the grim jaw of the desert. As he rode down the main street, the silence of his ranch was replaced by the clatter and murmur of the town. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to watch him pass. They nodded, and he nodded back. But their eyes held a new kind of curiosity, a sizing up. They were not just seeing a grieving neighbor. They were seeing acres. They were seeing access to the bitter willow. Harlan felt their gazes like a physical weight. He dismounted in front of the general store, which shared its space and its proprietor with the post office. The bell above the door chimed, a sound too bright for the mood that hung in the air. The store was a cluttered cavern of smells leather, coffee beans, cured meat, and Mara's ink. She was at the counter, her back to him, her head bent over a ledger. The simple leather strap holding her hair seemed to draw all the light in the dim room. Harlan moved quietly toward the large barrels near the back, scooping the coarse salt into a burlap sack. When he turned, she was facing him. Their eyes met across the cluttered space. It was not a moment of fire or spark, but one of profound and unexpected stillness. In her gaze, he saw a quiet weariness that mirrored his own. But beneath it was an unbent strength, a resilience as tough and plain as the land itself. She saw him, too. Not just the broad shoulders or the sun-creased lines around his eyes, but the vast, aching loneliness that surrounded him like a shroud. It was a landscape she understood. The moment stretched, silent and deep, as if they had stepped out of the flow of time. It was a look that asked for nothing and acknowledged everything. "Salt," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Yes," she replied softly, her own voice a low, steady thing. She took the sack from him, her fingers brushing the rough burlap, and placed it on the scale. She moved with an economy of motion, a practiced grace. There was no wasted effort, no flourish. She was a woman who knew the value of conserving energy. He paid, their hands coming close but never touching, and then he was gone. The bright little bell announcing his departure. Mara stood for a long moment, her hand resting on the counter, the faint warmth of his presence still hanging in the air. From his perch on a chair tipped against the wall of the sheriff's office, Deputy Orrin Tate saw it all. He saw Harlan's horse, saw him enter the store, and saw the way he walked back out. His shoulders set, his face unreadable. Tate's ambition was a constant, sour taste in his mouth. He was a man who saw the law not as a set of principles, but as a set of tools. And he wanted Harlan's land. He'd made an offer the year before, a low, insulting price that Harlan had refused without a word, just a slow, dismissive shake of his head. The memory of that silent rejection still stung. Now, with Bellamy and the railroad in play, the Pike Ranch, with its long, unbroken access to the bitter willow, was the key to the entire valley. Tate watched Harlan mount his horse and ride out of town, a cold resolve hardening in his gut. The rancher's solitude, he thought, made him vulnerable. A man with no one to stand beside him was a man who could be easily broken. As Harlan's figure shrank against the immense backdrop of the desert, the wind began to rise in earnest. It came in a sudden, violent gust, kicking up a wall of dust that momentarily blotted out the sun. It rattled the windows of the post office and tore a loose shutter from its hinge. Mara stepped to the doorway, squinting into the swirling grit, watching the spot where the rider had disappeared. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she felt a sudden, unfamiliar stirring in her chest, A feeling so close to hope it was painful. It was a dangerous, foolish feeling. She knew better. This land, this life, did not reward hope. It punished it. Instinctively, her hand went to the back of her neck, to the familiar, comforting roughness of the leather strap. Her fingers closed around it, and she pulled it tight. The slight pinch a welcome, grounding reality. It was a silent promise to herself, a vow to keep herself anchored, to not let the strange, unsettling winds of change carry her away. A few days later, a heavy stillness settled over Sagebrush Bend, the kind that often precedes a storm. The air was thick and tasted of dust. Harlan rode into town again, this time for a new strap for a feed bucket. The bell on the general store door seemed to clang with a note of warning. Mara was behind the counter, as always, a small, still point in the cluttered room. He nodded to her, his customary greeting. But this time she didn't just nod back. She offered a small, hesitant smile that seemed to cost her something. When he brought the leather strap to the counter, she took her time wrapping it in a piece of brown paper, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate care. The silence between them felt different today. It was not empty, but filled with the unspoken memory of their last encounter. "For the horses?" she asked, her voice quiet. The question was an offering, a small bridge built across the space between them. Harlan was surprised by the simple inquiry. Most people in town spoke to him of land or weather, if they spoke to him at all. "And the table," he replied, his voice still carrying the rasp of solitude. The old one broke. She looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his. "You have a fine herd. I see them sometimes. From the ridge, when the light is right." It was a clumsy attempt at conversation, the words chosen with a careful uncertainty. But they landed on Harlan with surprising force. No one had called his horses fine in years. He saw them as work, as duty, as the last living remnants of a life that had been. To hear them described with simple admiration softened something in him. The hard lines around his eyes seemed to relax. "Just for a moment. They're good stock," he said, and the words felt inadequate. He wanted to say more, to tell her about the mare who could outrun the wind and the foal with the curious spirit. But the language of connection had grown foreign to him. Before the silence could reclaim them, the store's bell jangled again, this time with a frantic energy. A boy of about 12, his face smudged with dirt and panic, burst into the store. He was the new mail boy, a cousin of the blacksmith, hired to run deliveries to the outlying homesteads. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest, his knuckles white. "Mrs. Ellison," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't find the Miller place. I took the wrong fork by the dry wash, and now the sky's turning mean." Mara leaned over the counter, her voice calm and reassuring. "It's all right. Jacob, just catch your breath." She looked past the boy, through the front window. The sky to the west had turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind was beginning to keen, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. A dust storm was coming, and a bad one by the look of it. The Miller homestead was a good 2 hours' ride, even for a man who knew the way. For a lost boy, it was a death sentence. Her gaze shifted from the boy to Harlan. It was a look of appeal, direct and unadorned. She was not asking for a favor. She was asking for a life. Harlan understood immediately. He was the only person in the store, and his ranch lay in the same direction as the Miller place. He knew every rock and ravine between here and there. "I'll take him," Harlan said. The decision was made before the words were fully formed. Gratitude washed over Mara's face, so pure and potent it was almost startling. "He can ride with you. His pony is tired." Harlan gave a curt nod. "Come on, boy. We haven't got much time." He led Jacob outside, lifted the slight boy onto Dust Devil's back behind the saddle, and mounted. As he gathered the reins, he glanced back at the store. Mara was standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim interior, her hand raised in a small, almost imperceptible wave. The wind tore at her dress and whipped strands of hair from their leather binding. For a fleeting second, Harlan felt a protective urge so fierce it was like a physical blow. He turned the horse and spurred it into a trot, heading out of town just as the first great wave of dust began to roll in from the desert. They rode hard, the world dissolving around them into a maelstrom of sand and wind. The sun was gone, replaced by a suffocating twilight. Harlan navigated by instinct, his internal map of the land more reliable than his eyes. The wind shrieked, and the sand stung their exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. As they neared the section of land bordering the bitter willow, Harlan pulled the mare to a halt. Even through the swirling dust, he could see them. Dozens of them, stuck into the dry earth along the riverbank. Wooden stakes, their tops painted a garish, angry red. They were survey markers, fresh ones, forming a straight, unyielding line that cut across the natural curves of the land. They were a declaration of intent, a new boundary drawn by an invisible hand, bypassing the law, bypassing the landowners, bypassing common decency. The railroad. This was Bellamy's work, a physical scarring of the valley that mirrored the greed poisoning the town. A cold anger, an emotion Harlan hadn't felt so keenly in years. Settled deep in his gut, this was his land they were marking, his water, the same water his father had drawn from. The temperature had dropped with the storm, and the wind now had a serrated edge. He looked back at Jacob, who was huddled behind him, shivering. Then he looked at the thin fabric of the boy's shirt. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy canvas duster, the one he'd worn for a decade, and shrugged it off. He passed it back to the boy. "Put this on." The act was simple, automatic, but as he felt the cold wind cut through his own shirt, something shifted inside him. He felt a flicker of a long-buried sensation, the ghost of a feeling that had once been as natural as breathing. It was the feeling of taking care of someone. And with that feeling came a strange, unfamiliar impulse. The muscles around his mouth tightened, a pulling sensation he barely recognized. It was the memory of a smile. They found the Miller homestead an hour later, a faint lantern glow cutting through the gloom. Harlan delivered the boy to his frantic mother, refused her offer of coffee and shelter, and turned Dust Devil back toward his own ranch. The storm was at its peak, and the ride was a battle against the elements. When he finally reached the relative safety of his barn, he was soaked with a mixture of sweat and the first fat, muddy drops of rain that had begun to fall. He was lighting a lantern when the barn door creaked open. He spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. Mara stood in the doorway, her hair and dress plastered to her skin, her face pale. She was leading her own horse, a small, sturdy mare. "The livery is full," she said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. "Everyone brought their animals in. I hoped you wouldn't mind." Harlan stared at her for a long moment, his mind struggling to process her presence in this space. His space. He simply nodded, taking the reins from her numb fingers. He led her horse to an empty stall, removed its saddle, and began rubbing the animal down with a dry sack. Mara watched him, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering. "There's a blanket in the house," he said, not looking at her. "Go on, I'll see to your horse." She didn't move. Her gaze had fixed on something in the corner of the barn. It was an old saddle, sitting on a wooden stand, covered by a piece of canvas. The leather was dark with age and oil, the silver conchos tarnished, but it was meticulously cared for. It was a work of art, a relic from another time. "That was my father's," Harlan said, his voice softer now. He stopped his work and looked at the saddle with her. "He built this ranch," said the land was stubborn, but honest. "He was a good man?" she asked. "The best," he hesitated, then continued, the words coming out slowly, as if being pulled from a deep well. "He and my mother, they didn't make it through the last big drought. The fever came with the dust. Took her first, then him, My boy, Daniel, he went last. He spoke the words flatly, a recitation of facts, but the air in the barn grew heavy with the unspoken grief. Mara's eyes filled with a deep, quiet compassion. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply stood with him in the charged silence, acknowledging his loss. It was in that moment, as she turned her head slightly in the lantern light, that he saw it clearly. The leather strap in her hair. It was made of braided strips of rawhide, worn smooth with time. And he knew it. He had seen a strap just like it 1,000 times in his childhood. His mother had owned a small book of poetry, its binding broken. She had kept the pages together with a strap just like that one, tied with the same simple knot. The memory was so vivid, so unexpected, that it took his breath away. The scent of his mother's baking, the sound of her humming, the sight of her hands tying that knot, it all came rushing back. A flood of warmth in the cold. Empty barn. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the barn, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The sky opened up, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, roaring sheets. A section of the stable roof, loosened by the wind, began to flap violently, letting in a cascade of water. "Help me!" Harlan yelled over the roar of the storm. They worked together in a frantic, unspoken rhythm. He climbed onto a stack of hay bales to reach the loose timbers, while she passed him a hammer and a handful of nails she'd found on a workbench. The wind and rain lashed at them. As he struggled to hold a flapping board in place, his hand slipped on the wet wood. He started to fall, and she reached up instinctively to steady him. Her hand covered his. Her skin was cold, but his was warm. The touch was brief, accidental, a fleeting moment of contact in the midst of chaos. But for both of them, it was like a lightning strike. Time seemed to slow, the roar of the storm fading to a dull hum. They were acutely aware of each other, of the simple, profound reality of another person's touch. Harlan pulled his hand away as if burned, his heart hammering against his ribs. He secured the roof, his movements clumsy now, and climbed down from the hay. The rain eventually softened to a steady drumming on the roof. The storm had passed. "You should stay," he said, his back still to her. "Wait until morning." "No," she said softly. "I should go. They'll worry at the boarding house." He didn't argue. He saddled her horse in silence, the air between them thick with things unsaid. When he led the horse out, the rain had stopped. The world was washed clean, smelling of wet earth and sagebrush. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing the ranch in a pale, silvery light. He helped her mount, his hands briefly circling her waist. It was a necessary gesture, but it felt intensely intimate. She rode away without a backward glance, a small, resolute figure disappearing into the night. Mara let her horse pick its way along the muddy track back to Sagebrush Bend. Her mind was a whirlwind, her body still humming from the storm, from the brief touch of his hand. The town was dark and quiet when she arrived, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows. As she approached the livery, a figure stepped out from the darkness of an alleyway. It was Orrin Tate. He was leaning against a post, chewing on a matchstick, his deputy's badge gleaming in the moonlight. "Evening, Miss Ellison," he said, his voice smooth and casual, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Late ride for you?" "Deputy," she acknowledged, her voice tight. "Looks like you got caught in that squall. Everything all right?" He let his gaze drift down the path she'd come from, the direction of the Pike Ranch. Funny thing, a storm like this can make a person take shelter in unlikely places. Mara's heart began to beat a little faster. She sat taller in the saddle, meeting his gaze directly. The livery was full. "Mister, Pike was kind enough to let me use his barn." Tate pushed himself off the post and took a step closer. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Harlan Pike. He's a quiet man. Keeps to himself. A man like that, you have to wonder what he's thinking, what he's planning." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. You spend much time out there with him." The question was too direct, too possessive. It was a warning. The threat that had been a whisper in the saloon was now standing in front of her, clear and menacing. He wasn't just interested in Harlan's land. He was interested in everything and everyone connected to it. "I don't see how that's any of your business, Deputy," Mara said, her voice colder than she intended. Tate's smile vanished. "In this town, Miss Ellison," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Everything is my business." He tipped his hat and melted back into the shadows, leaving Mara alone in the cold, clean air, the weight of his threat settling upon her like a shroud. The days following the storm were coiled with a tense, watchful quiet. Mara's brief, sharp exchange with Orrin Tate had left a residue of fear, a metallic taste in the back of her throat. She moved through her duties at the post office with a heightened awareness, sorting the mail not just as a clerk, but as a sentinel. Every hoofbeat in the street, every raised voice from the saloon, seemed to carry a potential threat. It was in this state of nervous vigilance, during a lull in the afternoon's heat, that she found it. She was clearing a high shelf in the back room, a place where forgotten parcels and unclaimed letters went to gather dust. Her hand brushed against a flat, rectangular object that had slipped down behind a row of old ledgers. It was a package, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone brittle with age and tied with a string that disintegrated at her touch. The address was written in a faded, elegant script. To a Mr. Elias Thorne, attorney at law, Sagebrush Bend. Mara frowned. Elias Thorne had been dead for the better part of 15 years, carried off by a fever before she'd even started working here. The package had no return address, only a faint, circular postmark from Red Butte, the county seat. A prickle of unease and curiosity ran up her arm. This was mail, and by law, she should attempt to find a next of kin or return it to the archives. But it was 15 years old. It was a ghost, driven by an instinct she couldn't name, an instinct sharpened by the red stakes along the river and Tate's menacing smile. She carefully worked a finger under the crumbling oilcloth. It split open, revealing a sheaf of folded papers. The top page was a copy, made with a press and carbon paper, the purple ink slightly blurred. The heading read, "Agreement of Water Franchise and Communal Access, Bitter Willow Basin, 1842. Her breath caught. She scanned the document, her eyes tripping over the dense, legalistic language. Words and phrases leaped out at her. In perpetuity for all settlers and their heirs, and the seasonal flow of the Bitter Willow River, from the Ash Mesa headwaters to the confluence at Dry Creek, shall be held in common trust. And finally, the sentence that made her heart stop. No private entity shall hold exclusive title to the aforementioned water rights, which are understood to be an indivisible aspect of the community charter. This was not a deed. This was a covenant. It declared that the river, the very lifeblood of the valley that Bellamy and the railroad were trying to buy and sell, belonged to everyone. It wasn't a commodity. It was a birthright. At the bottom of the last page was a faint, embossed seal, partially obscured by an ink smudge. She held it to the light. The lettering was tiny, but she could just make it out, Office of the County Clerk, Red Butte. This was a copy of an official document, one that should have been in the county records. And it had been hidden here, unsent, for a decade and a half. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. This wasn't an oversight. This was a secret, deliberately buried. Before she could fully process the implications, the sound of a horse galloping hard down the main street shattered the afternoon quiet. She rushed to the front window. It was one of Bellamy's men, a hired hand with a loud voice and an arrogant posture. He reined his horse to a dramatic stop in front of the saloon. "Town meeting," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. "Horace Bellamy invites every landowner to the Lantern Room tonight. Cash offers for all deeds, one night only." He spurred his horse on, shouting the same message as he went. The town. which had been dozing in the heat, began to stir. Doors opened. Men stepped out onto the boardwalks, their faces a mixture of suspicion and raw, naked hope. One night only. It was an ultimatum. Bellamy wasn't negotiating anymore. He was closing his fist around the town. Mara looked down at the purple-inked words in her hand. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this meeting was designed to make documents like this one irrelevant forever. Later, as the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the street, Orrin Tate pushed through the swinging doors of the Lantern Room. The saloon's owner, Dahlia Voss, a formidable woman with hair the color of rust and eyes that had seen too much, was polishing glasses behind the bar. She gave Tate a cool, measured look. "What can I get for you, deputy?" she asked, her tone making it clear she was not in the mood for trouble. Tate ignored the question. He leaned on the bar, his presence radiating a lazy menace. "Dahlia, Harlan Pike's account. I was just looking over the town ledgers. He runs a tab here for grain and supplies." "Most ranchers do," she said, not missing a beat with her polishing cloth. "From now on," Tate said, his voice low and devoid of any warmth. "His account is to be settled at the end of each week. In cash. No more credit." Dahlia stopped her work and placed the glass down with a deliberate click. She folded her arms. "Orrin, I've been running this place since before you had hair on your chin. I decide who gets credit and who doesn't." Tate's eyes hardened. He tapped the tarnished silver badge on his vest. "This isn't a request. Bellamy needs those deeds signed tonight. A man with a long line of credit feels secure. A man who's being squeezed, who can't feed his stock. He feels desperate. Desperate men sign papers they don't read." He straightened up. His point made. "Settle his account weekly. Cash only. Unless you want me to start looking into the particulars of your liquor license." He turned and walked out, leaving Dahlia staring after him, her face a mask of fury. The squeeze was on. They were working to isolate Harlan, to cut his tethers to the town and leave him stranded on his island of grief and dust. Mara didn't hesitate. As soon as she saw Dahlia's face through the saloon window, as soon as the last light faded from the sky, she locked the post office door. She didn't go to her room at the boarding house. She saddled her mare, her movements quick and efficient. She tucked the folded document inside her dress, the stiff paper a strange comfort against her skin. She rode out of town under the cover of the gathering dusk, pushing her horse harder than she ever had before. Harlan was in the barn, the warm, yellow glow of a single lantern pushing back the shadows. He was mending a bridle, his large, capable hands moving with a practiced, gentle rhythm. He looked up, startled, as she rode into the barn, her horse's sides heaving. His first expression was one of deep suspicion. A second visit, unannounced, in as many weeks. It was a disruption to the careful, empty order of his life. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. She slid from the saddle before he could help her, her legs unsteady. "They're trying to steal it. Harlan," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "All of it." She pulled the papers from her dress and thrust them into his hands. "I found this. It was hidden in the post office." He took the document, his skepticism etched on his face. He was a man who believed in the solid reality of fences and hooves, not in the flimsy promises of paper and ink. He held the pages close to the lantern, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read slowly, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. Mara watched his face, watched the play of light and shadow across the hard, lonely planes of his cheeks. She saw the moment his skepticism faltered, replaced by a dawning, incredulous understanding. He stopped, his finger tracing a line of the faded purple text. "The seasonal flow," he read aloud, his voice a low rumble. He looked up from the page, not at her, but through her, into the past. His eyes, which usually held the flat, distant look of the desert horizon, were now sharp, focused, and lit from within by a spark of something fierce. The spring floods, the water that fills the basins on the east pasture. My grandfather used to say that water belonged to the sky and the land, not to any one man. He looked back at the paper. He was right. It's written right here. Bellamy is getting everyone to sign over their land tonight, Mara said, the urgency returning to her voice. At the Lantern Room, he's offering cash. Harlan's jaw tightened. He understood the strategy instantly. It was a legal ambush. Get the signatures on the deeds before anyone could unearth a competing claim. By the time the circuit judge arrived in Red Butte, it would be a settled matter. A stack of signed, sealed, and delivered documents. But this paper, this changed everything. This is a copy, he said, thinking aloud. The original has to be in the county archives in Red Butte. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt like he was truly seeing her, not as an intruder, but as an ally. If we can get this document in front of a judge, we can file for a temporary stay, an injunction, a court order to stop them from driving another stake until the claim is sorted. It was a fragile thread of hope, but it was the only one they had. We ride for Red Butte, he said, the decision solidifying in his voice. Tonight. We have to be there when the clerk's office opens in the morning. He looked at her mare, a fine animal but not built for the hard, fast ride ahead. He walked over to a stall and let out a slim, graceful mare with a coat the color of a twilight sky. This is Sparrow. She's sure-footed and she has heart. She'll get you there. He began to saddle the horse, his movements economical and precise. Mara stood by, feeling useless. Show me, she said. He paused and looked at her. What? Show me how to do it right, so I don't slow you down. A flicker of something surprise, respect passed through his eyes. He nodded. He guided her through the process, his voice a low, patient murmur against the quiet sounds of the barn. He showed her how to lay the blanket just so, to avoid sores, how to settle the saddle so it wouldn't shift, how to tighten the cinch strap. Not too tight at first. Then a final pull after the horse had breathed out. His hands brushed against hers as he guided them, his touch practical and impersonal. Yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her. In the quiet intimacy of the lantern-lit barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horse and old leather, they were no longer just a lonely rancher and a post office clerk. They were partners, bound by a shared, desperate purpose. When the mare was ready, Mara took the precious document and folded it carefully into a tight, neat roll. It seemed impossibly fragile, a whisper of purple ink against an empire of iron and money. On impulse, she reached behind her head and untied the leather strap that held her hair. The dark mass of it tumbled free over her shoulders. She took the document and wrapped the worn, braided leather around it, pulling it tight and securing it with the simple, familiar knot she had tied every morning for years. It was the one thing of value she owned, the last tangible piece of her mother. She was entrusting it to this mission. She held the leather-bound roll out to him. You should keep it, she said. It will be safer with you. Harlan looked from the roll to her face, framed by her unbound hair. He understood the symbolism of the gesture, the depth of the trust she was placing in him. He took the small packet, its weight in his hand feeling far greater than that of a few sheets of paper. It felt like a promise. I'll keep it safe, he said, and the simple words were an oath. The lantern room was a box of trapped heat and sour air. Every lantern in the place was lit, their flames casting a greasy, yellow light that danced on the sweat-slicked faces of the men packed inside. The saloon, usually a place of lazy conversation and lonely drinking, was charged with a nervous, electric energy. It smelled of stale spirits, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of greed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their boots scraping on the sawdust-covered floorboards, their eyes fixed on the man at the front of the room. Horace Bellamy stood behind a large poker table he'd commandeered, a small island in a sea of anxious faces. He was a master of the stage. his tailored coat immaculate despite the oppressive heat, his voice a smooth, confident balm intended to soothe suspicion. On the table in front of him, sitting on the green felt like a sacred idol, was a heavy canvas bag. It bulged with the promise of a different future, its mouth tied shut, hinting at the wealth within. "Gentlemen," Bellamy began, his voice cutting through the low murmur, "I see before me the pioneers of this valley, men who have fought this hard land and carved a life from it. But the future is not about fighting the land. It's about partnering with it. The railroad is that partner. It is a river of iron that will bring prosperity to your doorstep, that will carry your goods to markets you've only dreamed of." He paused, letting his words sink in. He gestured to the bag of coins. "This is not a payment for your past. It is an investment in your future, a future of progress, of connection, of wealth. Sign the deeds tonight, and that future begins now." In the back of the room, half hidden in the deep shadows near the door, Harlan Pike stood motionless. He had come not to sign, but to watch, to see the faces of his neighbors as they contemplated selling their birthright. He felt a cold, familiar hollowness inside him, the same emptiness that echoed through his silent house. The room was full, yet he had never felt more alone. His stillness did not go unnoticed. Orrin Tate detached himself from the bar, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He moved through the crowd with a predator's grace. His eyes locked on Harlan. He stopped a few feet away, a smirk playing on his lips. "Pike," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over Bellamy's speech. "Come to join the celebration or just to watch your world end?" Harlan didn't answer. He kept his gaze fixed on Bellamy, his jaw set like a stone. Tate took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes glittering in the lantern light. "I hear you're running low on supplies. Dahlia's tightening up the credit. Tough break." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper laced with malice. "You know, that bag of silver on the table could buy a lot of grain, a lot of salt." He paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the final, cruel twist of the knife. "Your horses can't drink money, Pike, but soon enough, they'll be drinking my water." The word struck Harlan with the force of a physical blow. It was a direct threat, a declaration of war. Every muscle in his body tensed, a primal urge to lash out rising in his throat. But he held himself in check, his anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He would not give Tate the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply stood there, a granite statue of defiance, and met the deputy's taunting gaze with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was at that moment that the swinging doors of the saloon creaked open. The conversations died, heads turned. Mara Ellison stood silhouetted against the deep indigo of the night sky. She was a stark, sober figure in the raucous, yellow-lit room. Her hair was unbound, falling over her shoulders, and her face was pale, her eyes wide but resolute. She walked into the saloon, and the crowd parted for her as if she were a specter. Her boots made no sound on the sawdust floor. Her focus was absolute, her path a straight line to the poker table at the front of the room. She did not look at Bellamy or the bag of coins. She walked to the table, and with a single, deliberate motion, she placed the small, leather-bound roll of papers on the green felt. It landed with a soft, definitive thud, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, profound silence. She did not release it immediately. Her hand rested on it for a long moment, a gesture of both offering and offense. It was not a plea, it was a challenge, laid down like a duelist's dagger. Bellamy was the first to recover. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. Well, Miss Ellison, to what do we owe the pleasure have you come to sign over the post office deed?" Mara slowly lifted her hand from the document. "This," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear that was making her heart hammer against her ribs, "is the 1842 Communal Access Agreement for the Bitter Willow Basin. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Bellamy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He picked up the roll. His movements casual, but his eyes were sharp. He unrolled it, glanced at the faded purple script, and then tossed it back onto the table. "A charming historical artifact, my dear," he scoffed, his condescending tone returning. "But this is 1859. We are not bound by the sentimental scribblings of our grandfathers. The law recognizes a greater principle, the right of development, the right of progress." "The law recognizes a contract," Mara countered, her voice rising slightly. "And that contract states the water belongs to the people of this valley. All of them. Not to you, not to the railroad." From behind the bar, Dahlia Voss, who had been watching the entire exchange with narrowed eyes, spoke into the tense quiet. "That's a county document. Isn't it stamped with the Red Butte seal?" She paused, wiping a clean glass with a cloth. "Funny. Orrin, that leather records box you were carrying out of the back room last week. It looked an awful lot like the ones the county clerk uses." Every eye in the room swiveled to Orrin Tate. The deputy's face went rigid, the color draining from his cheeks. It was not a direct accusation, but the implication was as clear as a gunshot. A secret had been brought into the light. At that exact moment, a powerful gust of wind, a rogue remnant of the recent storm, slammed against the saloon. It rattled the window panes and forced its way through the cracks in the walls. The lanterns hanging from the ceiling beams swayed wildly, their flames guttering. Shadows leaped and danced across the room, plunging faces into darkness and then throwing them into sharp, distorted relief. It was the moment of chaos Tate had been waiting for. In the flickering, uncertain light, he lunged. He was not aiming for Harlan, but for the document on the table. His hand shot out, his fingers spread to snatch the paper. But Harlan was faster. He moved with a speed born of pure instinct, his body a blur of motion. He threw himself forward, not to grab the document, but to intercept Tate. His shoulders slammed into the deputy's side. The poker table went over with a violent crash, the heavy canvas bag of coins hitting the floor and splitting open, silver dollars scattering across the sawdust like fallen stars. Men scrambled back, cursing and shouting as chairs splintered and bodies collided. The room erupted into chaos, in the swirling mass of confusion. Harlan and Tate were locked together, a tangle of limbs and fury. Harlan had his hand clamped around Tate's wrist, twisting it away from the precious roll of paper that had fallen to the floor. Tate snarled, his other hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. Amid the pandemonium, no one was watching Mara. As men shoved and shouted around her, she stood as still as a statue in the eye of a hurricane. Her hand moved swiftly, almost invisibly, to the front of her dress. Her fingers brushed against a second, identical sheaf of papers tucked inside the original carbon copies she had made before leaving the post office. A silent, desperate prayer of thanks went through her mind for the simple, worn leather belt currently wrapped around the document on the floor. The one Tate was trying so desperately to seize, the one that was just a decoy. Harlan used his leverage, shoving Tate backward over a broken chair. The deputy fell with a grunt, his head hitting the floor hard. For a heartbeat, he was dazed. It was all the time Harlan needed. He scooped the leather-bound roll from the floor, grabbed Mara's arm, and pulled her toward the back of the saloon. The kitchen, he yelled over the din. They shoved their way through the now brawling crowd, a chaotic mix of men fighting over scattered coins, and others simply caught up in the sudden violence. They burst through a swinging door into the saloon's kitchen, a small, cluttered space, thick with the smell of grease and stale food. Harlan didn't slow. He unlatched the heavy wooden back door and pushed it open. The cool night air was a shock after the suffocating heat of the saloon. They stumbled out into a dark, narrow alleyway. Behind them, they could hear Tate's voice, raw with fury, rising above the chaos. "Don't let them get away, Night Patrol after them. Stop them!" The sounds of pursuit, of heavy boots pounding on the boardwalk, began almost immediately. Without a word, Harlan pulled Mara along, and together they ran. two desperate fugitives swallowed by the vast, unforgiving darkness of the frontier night. The night swallowed them whole. They rode not on a road, but on the raw, unforgiving skin of the desert. Two small figures against an immense and indifferent landscape. The wind was a physical force, tearing at their clothes and trying to steal the breath from their lungs. Above them, a sliver of moon hung in the black, star-dusted sky, its sharp, curved edge like the blade of a freshly honed saw, offering no comfort, only a cold, clinical light. They were crossing Ash Mesa, a desolate tableland of shattered rock and skeletal brush. Harlan rode in the lead, a dark, broad-shouldered shape moving with a grim, forward purpose. Mara followed on Sparrow, the mare's sides already lathered with sweat, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Behind them, back in the direction of the distant, sleeping town, came the sound. At first it was just a tremor in the ground, a vibration felt more than heard. Then it grew, resolving itself into a distinct, rhythmic drumming. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. They were being pursued. The sound was a relentless, terrifying promise of capture. A pack of wolves closing in on its prey. Harlan urged his horse faster, and Mara dug her heels into Sparrow's flanks, her unbound hair whipping across her face like a dark flag of surrender. They were no longer running from a saloon brawl. They were running for their lives, for the very idea of a future. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the canyons, a sound that ripped the fabric of the night. It was followed by the high, angry whine of a bullet passing too close over their heads. The sound was alien and obscene in the vast, natural silence. Sparrow screamed, a terrified, high-pitched sound, and shied violently, her body twisting in panic. Mara, caught off guard, was nearly unseated. She clung to the reins, her knuckles white, her own fear a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, as she fought to bring the trembling mare under control. This way, Harlan's voice cut through her panic, a low, commanding sound that was an anchor in the chaos. He wheeled his horse, not toward the open plains where they would be easily overtaken, but toward a dark, jagged slash in the face of the mesa, a place that looked like a dead end, a maw of solid rock. He led them into a narrow canyon, a place the locals called Dry Ladder. It was not a trail for the faint of heart. The path was barely wider than a single horse, with a sheer rock wall rising on one side and a precipitous drop into darkness on the other. Loose scree shifted and slid under the horse's hooves, the sound of the dislodged pebbles rattling down into the abyss, a constant reminder of the danger. This was Harlan's territory. He moved through it with a confidence that came not from bravado, but from a deep, ingrained knowledge of every twist and turn. He knew which rocks were stable and which would betray them. For any other rider, at this speed, in this darkness, it would have been suicide. For Harlan, it was their only chance. Mara focused on the dark shape of his back, trusting him completely. She gave Sparrow her head, allowing the mare's natural sure-footedness to guide them. They navigated a series of treacherous switchbacks, the pursuing hoofbeats growing fainter now. Confused by the echoing acoustics of the canyon, they had gained a little time. As they rounded a sharp bend, the path narrowed even further. Mara's leg brushed against the cold, rough face of the canyon wall. In that moment of distraction, Sparrow's front hoof slipped on a patch of loose shell. The world tilted violently. Mara felt herself sliding from the saddle, a choked cry escaping her lips. Her hand scrabbled for purchase, her fingers scraping against raw stone, but found nothing. For a sickening heartbeat, she was falling, the black, empty space of the canyon reaching up to claim her. Then, a hand clamped around her wrist. It was Harlan. He had reined in his own horse and reached back for her in a single, fluid motion. His grip was like iron, a solid, unbreakable anchor in her terrifying descent. He pulled, his muscles straining, and hauled her from the edge of the abyss. She scrambled back onto the path, her body trembling uncontrollably. her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He dismounted and stood before her, his hand still holding hers, his chest rising and falling heavily. In the faint, cold light of the saw-blade moon, they stared at each other. The chaos of the chase, the danger of the canyon, all of it faded away, leaving only this single, charged point of connection. The vast, empty space that had always existed between them, the space of grief, of loneliness, of unspoken words suddenly collapsed. It shrank until it was no bigger than a speck of dust caught on an eyelash, an insignificant distance that could be erased with a single breath. His hand was rough and calloused around hers, but his grip was not painful. It was protective, possessive. He had saved her. He had chosen to save her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. She could only nod, incapable of speech. He released her hand slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact, and moved to calm the still nervous horses. The moment passed, but the memory of it, the feeling of his hand holding hers, remained, branded into her skin. They continued on, but at a slower, more cautious pace. After another hour, Harlan led them off the main path, into a small, hidden alcove sheltered by a towering overhang of rock. It was a place no one would find by chance. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his voice quiet. "Give the horses a breather. They won't follow us this far into the ladder at night. They'll wait for first light." He looked back toward the canyon entrance. "We can use that to our advantage." Working together in the darkness, they gathered dry scrub and brittle branches, a mile back down the trail, in a place that was visible from the canyon mouth. He built a small, deliberate campfire. It was a calculated risk, a gamble. A large, roaring fire would signal a camp, but a small, struggling fire, one that looked like it was about to die out, that might suggest fugitives who were cold, exhausted, and careless. It was a decoy, a ghost fire meant to draw their pursuers' attention and buy them precious time. He struck a match, and the tiny flame sprang to life, a fragile orange flower in the immense darkness. They retreated to their hidden alcove and watched the small fire from a distance. The thin ribbon of smoke rose into the still night air, carrying the scent of burning sagebrush. As Mara drew her thin dress tighter around her for warmth, she caught another scent on the air, carried on the faint breeze from where Harlan stood a few feet away. It was the smell of worn leather, of horse and sweat, and the faint, musky, masculine scent of his canvas coat. It was the scent of the man who had just saved her life, and it was strangely comforting. The silence in their hiding place was deep and profound, broken only by the soft stamping of the horses and the distant whisper of the wind. "My mother," Mara said, her voice barely audible, as if she were speaking to herself. She kept it her whole life. Harlan turned to look at her, his face an unreadable mask of shadows. "Kept what?" "The belt, the strap I used on the papers." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. It was hers. It was the only thing she had left of my father. He was a trapper. He died in the mountains before I was born. She never talked about him much, but every morning she would tie that belt around a small bundle of his letters. It wasn't a sad thing. It was a ritual, a way of keeping him close. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with memory. She told me once she kept it to remember a man who never once raised his voice, a man who never spoke a loud word in his life. She looked up at Harlan, and in the dim light he could see the glint of unshed tears in her eyes. She spent her whole life surrounded by the noise of the world, but she held on to that one quiet thing. Harlan listened, his usual stony expression softening into something else, something vulnerable. He understood. He understood the profound appeal of quietness in a world that was always shouting. He, who had wrapped himself in a shroud of silence for 3 long years, understood perfectly. He turned his gaze back toward the distant, flickering decoy fire. "I'm afraid to speak loudly to it," he admitted. The words pulled from a place deep inside him, a place he never showed to anyone. Mara looked at him, confused. To what? The loneliness, he said, the word hanging in the cold night air between them. Some days, it's so big, so loud in the quiet of the ranch. I'm afraid if I ever spoke back to it, if I ever gave it a name out loud, its roar would be the only thing I'd ever hear again. It was a confession of staggering honesty, a baring of the soul from a man who had kept his heart locked away for years. In that shared moment of vulnerability, they were no longer a rancher and a clerk. They were two lonely people, sitting in the dark, who had just admitted to each other that they were haunted by the same ghost, the ghost of a love that was too quiet and a grief that was too loud. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the unspoken understanding between them more powerful than any words. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, they mounted their horses and began the final, careful descent out of Dry Ladder. They emerged from the canyon just as the sun broke over the horizon. The sunrise was a violent, beautiful thing, a slash of crimson and gold that set the clouds on fire and painted the vast, sandy plains below them in shades of blood and rose. The desert, which had been a place of terror and shadow during the night, was transformed into a landscape of breathtaking, austere beauty. And there, in the distance, nestled against a series of red rock buttes that glowed in the morning light, was a small collection of buildings, a smudge of civilization on the endless canvas of the desert. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin gray plumes against the impossibly blue sky. Red Butte. It shimmered in the clear morning air, a promise of law, of justice, of a fight they might actually have a chance of winning. After the long, dark night of running, the sight of it was like a prayer answered. It was a beacon of hope. It was a salvation, glowing red in the dawn. The Red Butte County Courthouse was not a grand hall of justice. It was a simple, two-story adobe building, its walls the color of dried blood that baked under the morning sun. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of dry paper, old wood, and the faint, acidic tang of ink. The sound of their boots on the wide, worn floorboards seemed deafeningly loud after the quiet of the open plains. Harlan and Mara stood for a moment just inside the heavy wooden doors. Blinking as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they were exhausted, covered in a fine layer of dust. But they were here. A man who seemed as old and dusty as the records he kept sat behind a tall counter. He had a fringe of white hair, spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and a face etched with the fine lines of 1,000 legal documents. He looked up from a ledger, his gaze neutral, patient, accustomed to the dramas that washed up on his shores. This was Milton Crane, the county clerk, a man who had been the keeper of Red Butte's secrets for 40 years. Harlan stepped forward, placing the leather-bound roll on the polished wood of the counter. The decoy. We need to file a claim, Harlan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. Milton Crane picked up the document without a word. He untied the worn leather strap Mara's strap and carefully unrolled the pages. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the first page. A slight frown creased his already furrowed brow. He read on, his expression shifting from mild professional interest to something deeper, something troubled. He held the page closer to the light filtering through a high, dirty window, his finger tracing the clause about the communal water rights. The bitter Willow Basin Covenant of 42, he murmured, more to himself than to them. I haven't seen a copy of this in decades. He looked up at them over the rim of his glasses, his gaze suddenly sharp. Assessing. This is a carbon copy. Where did you get this? Before Mara could answer, the courthouse doors burst open with a crash, flooding the room with harsh, bright sunlight. 3 men strode in, their boots loud and aggressive on the wooden floor. Horace Bellamy led the way, his fine Eastern suit looking absurdly out of place, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him was Orrin Tate, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. With them was a third man, powerfully built and dressed in the severe, practical attire of a railroad man. His face was hard, impatient, a face used to timetables and the brute force of iron and steam. Crane Bellamy's voice boomed, a shocking violation of the room's dusty quiet. "There you are. We're here to file the preliminary deeds for the Sagebrush Bend acquisitions, a matter of great public interest." He threw a thick portfolio of papers onto the counter. A deliberate act of dominance. He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Edison Hare, the regional director for the Southwestern Pacific Railroad. He's here to ensure this transaction is expedited. The future of this territory depends on it." "Mr." Hare gave a curt, impatient nod, his eyes dismissing Harlan and Mara as insignificant obstacles. Milton Crane did not look at the new arrivals. His attention was still fixed on the document in his hands, a matter of public interest. He repeated softly, "Indeed." Tate saw the document and his face darkened. "That's stolen property," he snarled, pointing a finger at Harlan. "He caused a disturbance at the lantern room and took it by force." "That's a lie," Mara said, her voice ringing out, clear and sharp as a bell. She reached inside her dress and pulled out the second, crisper copy of the document, the real one. She laid it on the counter next to the first one. "This is the true copy. And this," she pointed to the embossed seal at the bottom, "is a forgery. The one Tate stole from the archives and planted in the post office was a poor imitation." Milton Crane picked up the second document. He held it side by side with the first. He didn't need to be an expert to see the difference. The seal on the decoy was crude, the lettering slightly off, but there was something else. He angled the paper toward the light, peering at the faint, spidery signature beneath the seal. His own signature, from a carbon copy he had made years ago. On the decoy document, it was smudged, blurry, as if someone had tried to obscure it. On the document Mara had just produced, it was faint, but perfectly clear. "My signature," Milton whispered, a flicker of cold anger in his old eyes. This was no longer just a legal dispute. It was a personal affront. Someone had not only stolen from his records, but they had also defiled his name. Harlan stepped forward, his presence solid, immovable. He addressed the clerk, but his voice was loud enough for all to hear. "We are formally requesting a temporary stay of execution on any new construction or land transfer related to the Bitter Willow River," he stated, the legal term sounding strange and powerful coming from him. "The spring rains are due. The river will rise. Those stakes your railroad planted are on land that will be underwater in a month, land that belongs to the common trust. According to this document, to proceed would be to invite disaster and violate a standing legal covenant." Tate laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "He's talking about floods while he's the one causing trouble. Ask him about the fight he started last night. He came into the saloon looking for a fight." "That's not true." The voice came from the doorway. All heads turned. Dahlia Voss stood there, her arms crossed, her expression one of grim determination. She must have ridden hard to get here so soon after them. "I own the lantern room." Harlan Pike didn't start a thing. He stood in the back and said nothing. "Orrin Tate is the one who provoked him. And I'm the one who saw Deputy Tate sneaking around my back rooms with a county records box a week ago." A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. Bellamy's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine alarm. He had underestimated the townspeople. He had underestimated this quiet rancher and this post office clerk. The courthouse doors creaked open again. Slowly this time, a woman stood there. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a simple but well-made black dress, the attire of a widow. Her face was plain, unadorned, but her eyes were remarkably intelligent and direct. They missed nothing. This was Judge Ada Romley, the circuit judge, a woman known throughout the territory for her sharp mind and her even sharper sense of justice. Her husband had been a judge before her, and when he died, she had petitioned the territorial governor and, through sheer force of will and legal acumen, had taken his place. It seems I've arrived in the middle of a rather interesting morning. Mr. Crane, she said, her voice calm and measured, but carrying an unmistakable authority that cut through the tension. She walked into the room, her gaze sweeping over each person, taking their measure. Milton Crane visibly relaxed, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Judge Romley, your arrival is most timely. Judge Romley walked to the counter and looked at the documents laid out. She listened without interruption as Milton explained the situation, his voice trembling slightly with indignation. She read the key passages of the water covenant, her expression unreadable. She looked at Bellamy and Hare, her gaze cold. Progress is not an excuse to trample on the law. Mr. Hare. She then turned her sharp eyes on Harlan and Mara. And you allege this document was removed from the official county records. We believe so, Your Honor, Mara said. The judge turned back to her clerk. Mr. Crane. The original covenant would have been filed in the 1840s ledger. Please retrieve it from the archives. A sense of dread and anticipation filled the room. This was the moment of truth. Everything depended on what was or was not in that dusty old book. Milton nodded and disappeared through a small door behind the counter. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving the occupants of the courtroom in a strained, silent tableau. Bellamy whispered urgently to Hare. Tate glared at Harlan, his hatred a palpable force. Dahlia stood by the door, a silent guardian, and Harlan and Mara stood side by side, their exhaustion forgotten, their entire beings focused on the small wooden door to the archives. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the loud, rhythmic ticking of a large clock on the wall. Then, from outside, another sound began. The slow, deep tolling of the town bell, announcing the noon hour. Dong, dong, dong. The sound was like a hammer blow, each strike marking the passage of a critical second. Just as the final bell toll faded, the door to the archives creaked open. Milton Crane emerged, holding a massive, leather-bound ledger. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, which he blew off in a small cloud. He carried it to the counter and opened it with reverent, careful hands. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with elegant, curling script. He ran a gnarled finger down the index. Basin Covenants, 1842, he murmured. He turned to the indicated page. He stopped. He stared at the page for a long, silent moment. Mr. Crane, Judge Romley prompted, her voice sharp. Milton looked up, his face pale. It's gone, Your Honor. He turned the book around for her to see. There, on the page, was a heading, Agreement of Water Franchise and Communal Access, Bitter Willow Basin. But beneath it, there was only an empty space, and along the stitched binding of the book was a thin, ragged edge of torn paper, a clear, undeniable scar, the wound left behind where a page had been crudely and violently ripped out. Judge Ada Romley stared at the torn page. Her face was like granite. She looked at Bellamy, at Tate, at Hare. Her gaze was cold enough to freeze water. She picked up a pen from the counter, dipped it in the inkwell, and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. The scratching of the nib was the only sound in the dead silent room. She wrote for a full minute, her hand moving in a swift, decisive script. When she was finished, she sprinkled sand on the ink to dry it, then blew it away. She took up a heavy wooden gavel. Based on the evidence presented, she announced, her voice ringing with the full authority of the law. I am issuing a temporary injunction. All survey and construction work by the Southwestern Pacific Railroad in the Bitter Willow Basin is hereby ordered to cease and desist for a period of 30 days. She brought the gavel down on the counter. The sharp, definitive crack echoed through the courtroom like a rifle shot. Furthermore, she continued, her eyes locking onto Tate and Bellamy, I am ordering the territorial marshal to open a full investigation into the matters of the altered county seal, the missing legal document, and the accusations of witness intimidation. She stood up, her presence seeming to fill the entire room. "This court is adjourned." A collective, silent exhalation seemed to suck all the air from the room. It was over, for now. A 30-day reprieve, a victory. But as Harlan met Mara's gaze across the dusty space, he knew this was not the end. It was just the beginning of the storm. The ride back from Red Butte was not a triumphant procession. It was a slow, weary journey under a sky that had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The victory in the courthouse felt fragile, a temporary dam holding back a flood of uncertainty. The 30 days Judge Romley had granted them felt less like a reprieve and more like the ticking of a clock. As they rode, the wind shifted, carrying not the dry heat of the high desert, but a cool, damp weight that smelled of distant rain and wet earth. The horizon to the west was no longer a sharp, clear line, but a dark, churning mass of clouds, roiling and gathering strength. By the time they reached the lowlands of the valley, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, not a gentle spring shower, but fat, heavy drops that splattered in the dust like silver coins. The Bitter Willow River, which had been a placid, shallow ribbon of water that morning, was already changing. It had taken on a murky, agitated quality, its current quickening, its surface disturbed by the wind. The prophecy Harlan had made in the courtroom was coming true. The seasonal flow, the lifeblood they had fought for on paper, was now rising to become a real and immediate threat. They saw the first signs of trouble at the Jensen homestead, a small farm perched precariously close to the riverbank. Old man Jensen and his 2 sons were frantically piling rocks and sacks of earth into a low, makeshift levee that looked pitifully inadequate against the river's growing strength. Further on, it was the same story at every farm that bordered the water. A quiet panic had set in. The very water that promised to end the long drought was now threatening to wash away what little the drought had left behind. Without a word passing between them, Harlan reined his horse toward the river. Mara followed. He dismounted, and with a nod to the stunned-looking Jensen, he grabbed a shovel and began to work, digging into the soft earth and heaping it onto the faltering wall. Mara slid from Sparrow's back and began dragging empty burlap sacks over, her movements mirroring his, a silent pact of shared labor. For the rest of that afternoon, they moved along the riverbank, a pair of tireless nomads bringing aid where it was needed. They were no longer the solitary rancher and the quiet post office clerk. They were a force of nature in their own right, moving with a singular, unified purpose. They worked until their muscles screamed and their hands were raw, caked with the thick, dark mud of the riverbed. The rain fell in a steady, relentless downpour, plastering their hair to their faces and soaking their clothes until they were heavy as lead. Their eyes, blurred by the rain and the stinging sweat, saw only the rising water and the work that needed to be done. A strange and wonderful thing began to happen. As other ranchers saw them, saw the reclusive Harlan Pike working like a man possessed to save his neighbor's land, they came out to join him. Men who, only the day before, had been ready to sign Bellamy's deeds, now picked up their own shovels. Men who had looked at Harlan with suspicion now worked alongside him, their grunts of effort and shared curses at the stubborn mud forming a new kind of community prayer. They were no longer a collection of isolated homesteads, each fighting its own lonely battle against the land. They were a valley, united by a common threat and a common purpose. They were fighting for their water, together. As dusk began to bleed into the gray, rain-swept afternoon, they finished the last section of the levee, a long, ugly but solid wall of mud and rock that held the churning brown water at bay. The ranchers, exhausted but filled with a new, unfamiliar sense of collective pride, clapped Harlan on the back and nodded their thanks to Mara. They offered them food, shelter, a place by their fires, but Harlan politely refused. He and Mara mounted their horses and rode the final, quiet mile to his ranch. The rain had softened to a gentle, persistent drumming on the roof of the barn. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of hay and wet horses. Harlan lit a lantern, its golden glow a small, peaceful sun in the gathering gloom. They moved in a comfortable silence, unsaddling the horses, rubbing them down with dry cloths, their movements synchronized, a dance they now knew by heart. When the animals were settled, they stood together under the shelter of the wide stable overhang, watching the rain fall in silvery sheets, turning the dusty ranch yard into a network of tiny, running streams. The world felt washed clean, new and uncertain. "I was going to sell it," Harlan said, his voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the sound of the rain. He was not looking at her, but out at the land. His land. The ranch. After they were gone. Mara turned to him, her expression soft, questioning. She said nothing, letting his confession unfold in its own time. "I told myself it was because the work was too much for one man," he continued, his voice a low, rough murmur. "But that was a lie. The work was the only thing that kept me sane. The real reason was the quiet, the sound of my own footsteps in an empty house, the sight of a single plate on the table at supper. It was a silence so loud, it was like a physical pain. I thought if I sold the land, moved on, went somewhere with noise, with people, I could outrun it." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the vast, desolate landscape of a loneliness so profound it had nearly consumed him. "I was a coward. I was ready to sell my father's legacy. To sell this, all of this, just to escape the sound of my own empty heart." Mara felt a wave of empathy so powerful it was almost dizzying. She understood. She reached out, not to touch him, but as if to gesture to the whole of her own quiet life. "I know that silence," she said softly. She looked down at her hands. Then her gaze fell upon the leather strap still tied around the documents he had placed on a nearby barrel. "That belt," she began, her voice a little stronger now. "I've worn it in my hair for as long as I can remember. After my mother died, I was so afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being swept away by this town, by all the empty promises and the hard faces. It felt like if I didn't hold on to something, I would just disappear, become a ghost." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. "So I held on to that. It was my anchor. Every morning, tying it in my hair, I could feel it there all day. A solid, real thing. It kept me grounded. It kept me from floating away on all the loneliness." He listened, his gaze fixed on her face, seeing for the first time the depth of the strength and the sorrow she had carried for so long. He had seen her as a fixture in the town, a quiet, steady presence. He had never seen the fierce, desperate battles she had been fighting every day just to hold her ground. He reached out then, his movement slow, deliberate. His calloused, mud-stained fingers gently touched the worn, braided leather of the strap where it was tied around the papers. He did not untie it. He simply traced the familiar pattern of the braid. "An anchor is a good thing," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air between them. "It keeps you safe in a storm." He looked from the strap to her eyes, and a slow, sad smile touched his lips. "But even an anchor has to be raised, Mara, if the ship is ever going to come into port." The words were a key, unlocking something deep inside her. He was offering her not just safety, but a destination, a harbor. He was telling her it was all right to let go, that she would not be swept away, because he would be there to catch her. Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back welled in her eyes and spilled down her rain-streaked cheeks. The rain on the roof, the lantern light, the smell of the wet earth. Everything seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in this single, perfect moment of understanding. He closed the small distance between them. He raised a hand, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek, his touch impossibly tender. He lowered his head, and in the soft, golden light of the stable, under the rhythmic drumming of the rain, He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of fire. It was a kiss of profound and startling quiet. It was slow and gentle, and tasted of rain and earth and the salt of her tears. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was a silent acknowledgement of all the lonely days and nights, a recognition of the shared pain they had both carried for so long. It was the end of one story and the beginning of another. It was a kiss that needed no words, for it spoke a language older and truer than any spoken tongue. It was the language of a ship, finally, gratefully, coming home to port, far away from the peace of the ranch, in the muddy, rutted street of a town on the edge of the territory. A different kind of storm was gathering. Orrin Tate, his face a thundercloud of rage and humiliation, stood in the flickering torchlight of a makeshift camp. He was not alone. Around him were a dozen men, hard-faced strangers with the dead-eyed look of men who sold their loyalty for coin and their violence for sport. They were not ranchers or townsfolk. They were hired guns, drifters with no stake in the land, no respect for the law. Bellamy's money had bought their services. "The judge's paper is worthless out here," Tate snarled, his voice cutting through the night. "The law is what we say it is. We're taking that water, and we're taking that ranch. We ride at dawn." He looked at the faces of the men gathered around him, their features illuminated in the dancing, hungry light of the flames, and he saw his own hatred reflected back at him. The court had spoken with a gavel. He would answer with fire and force. The night was alive with the sound of the river, the bitter willow, swollen and muscular, gnawed at its banks. The current a low, constant growl. A line of lanterns bobbed along the muddy shore, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. This was not a celebration, but an act of reclamation. Under the fragile legal shield of Judge Romley's injunction, Harlan, Mara, and a determined group of ranchers were methodically pulling Horace Bellamy's red survey stakes from the soaked earth. Each stake came out with a wet, sucking sound, a small victory against the encroaching iron and greed. There was a grim satisfaction in the work. Harlan moved with a powerful economy of motion, his shoulders straining as he wrenched the wooden markers from the ground. Mara worked beside him, her hands muddy, her face set with a resolve that had been forged in the Red Butte courthouse. The other ranchers, Jensen, Miller, and a half-dozen others who had once been tempted by Bellamy's silver, worked with a silent, focused anger. They were no longer just defending their individual plots of land. They were defending the valley itself, their shared home. The injunction, a mere piece of paper, had become a banner they could all rally behind. They were so absorbed in their task that they didn't hear the riders until it was too late. The sound came suddenly, a thundering of hooves that was not the friendly rhythm of a neighbor's horse, but the heavy, menacing beat of a war party. They looked up from their work, their shovels and crowbars held like weapons. A line of dark figures on horseback crested the low ridge above the river, silhouetted against the stormy, moonless sky. At their head was Orrin Tate. They descended on the small group like a pack of wolves, not with guns drawn, but with something almost more menacing. The men with Tate were the hard-faced strangers from the saloon, their eyes cold and empty. In their hands, they carried not rifles, but torches and heavy lengths of chain. The firelight glinted on the metal links, a promise of brute force and subjugation. They fanned out, forming a semicircle that trapped the ranchers between their horses and the churning river. Horace Bellamy emerged from the center of the riders, his fine suit now spattered with mud. He held up a piece of paper, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "Evening, folks. I'm afraid your little rebellion is over." Harlan stepped forward, his body shielding Mara. "We have a court order. Bellamy, you're in defiance of a federal judge." "An injunction is a temporary measure," Bellamy said smoothly, waving the paper in his hand. "This, however, is a newly filed writ of eminent domain, signed this afternoon in a special session at the territorial capital. It supersedes your little local order. It grants the Southwestern Pacific Railroad immediate and unrestricted access to this entire riverfront for the good of the public. He handed the document to Harlan. It looked official, adorned with a large, impressive-looking wax seal. But as Harlan took it, Mara leaned in, her eyes narrowing in the torchlight. She had spent years handling official mail, her gaze accustomed to the minute details of seals and stamps. She saw it in an instant. "It's a fake," she said, her voice clear and sharp. Bellamy's smile tightened. "I assure you, young lady." "The seal," she interrupted, pointing a muddy finger at the red wax. "It's the territorial eagle, but it's been pressed backward. The eagle is facing left. On every official document, the eagle faces right, toward the olive branch, not the arrows." A stunned silence fell over the riverbank. Every rancher stared at the document in Harlan's hand, then at Bellamy's face. Mara's quiet observation, born of years of meticulous work, had unmasked his lie with a simple, undeniable fact. The writ was a forgery, a desperate, arrogant bluff. Bellamy's face contorted in a brief flash of pure fury before he regained his composure. He looked at Tate, a silent order passing between them. The time for deception was over. Harlan saw the look. He held up his hands, a gesture of peace. "There's no need for this to go any further," he said, his voice a low, reasonable appeal to the men behind Tate. "This is a legal matter, to be settled in a courtroom, not with chains and torches on a riverbank." Tate responded not with words, but with action. He spurred his horse forward, a long black leather whip uncoiling in his hand. Old man Jensen, the closest rancher, stood his ground, his shovel held defensively. Tate's arm blurred in the torchlight. The whip cracked through the air with a sound like a rifle shot, a vicious, cutting hiss. The leather lash caught Jensen across the shoulder, tearing through his shirt and leaving a dark, bleeding line in its wake. The old man cried out and staggered back, dropping his shovel. The fragile piece shattered. A raw, guttural roar of outrage erupted from the ranchers. The simmering anger of weeks of intimidation and legal maneuvering exploded into open violence. They charged forward, their shovels and crowbars now swung with a desperate fury. The scene devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee of bodies and shadows. Men shouted and cursed, their grunts of pain and effort mixing with the roar of the river. Harlan moved to Jensen's side, helping the old man to his feet, before turning to face two of Tate's hired men who were advancing on him with chains. He met their charge, his fists moving with a brutal efficiency, a lifetime of hard labor giving him a raw, untutored strength that surprised them. In the midst of the brawl, Dahlia Voss, who had been watching from the edge of the group, pushed her way toward Mara. "Here," she said, her voice grim, pressing a heavy, metallic object into Mara's hand. "It's not much, but it's loaded. Point it and pull the trigger." Mara looked down. In her palm lay a small, 5-barreled pistol, an old pepperbox model. It felt alien and heavy, a cold lump of death in her hand. She watched as one of Tate's men cornered a young rancher, raising a length of chain to strike. Her hand tightened on the pistol's grip. Dahlia's words echoed in her head. "Point it and pull the trigger." But as she raised the weapon, another image filled her mind, her mother, sitting quietly, her hands tying the worn leather strap around a bundle of letters. A quiet ritual to honor a man who never raised his voice. Violence was Tate's language. It was Bellamy's language. She would not let it become hers. She saw Tate on his horse, lashing out with his whip at another man. He was laughing, a cruel, ugly sound. He was the center of the violence, the source of the poison. Lowering the pistol, Mara acted on pure instinct. She reached behind her back, her fingers fumbling with the simple knot at the nape of her neck. She pulled the leather strap from her hair, the one she had retrieved from Harlan after their return. It was worn, familiar, an extension of herself. Holding one end firmly, she swung the other end over her head like a sling. She was not a fighter, but she had spent her life measuring things weight, distance, the arc of a thrown mail sack. She let the strap fly. The braided leather hissed through the air, a sound eerily similar to Tate's whip. It wrapped itself perfectly around Tate's wrist, the knot at the end catching on his glove. Mara yanked back with all her strength. Tate, caught completely by surprise, was jerked forward. The pistol he had just drawn from his holster flew from his grasp, spinning end over end before landing with a soft thud in the thick mud near the river's edge. Tate roared in frustration and pain, trying to untangle the leather strap from his wrist. For a moment, the fighting around them seemed to pause. The combatants on both sides stunned by the sight of the quiet post office clerk disarming the formidable deputy with nothing more than a strip of old leather. That moment of stunned silence was broken by a new sound, a deep, groaning tremor that came not from the fight, but from the earth beneath their feet. The small wooden bridge that crossed the bitter willow a few yards upstream, the only crossing for miles, began to shudder violently. The river, engorged and furious, had finally undermined its foundations. With a sound of splintering wood and tearing nails, a section of the bridge collapsed into the churning water, the dark timbers swallowed instantly by the current. The river was rising faster now, spilling over its banks in the low-lying areas, turning the ground where they fought into a treacherous, ankle-deep quagmire. The reality of their situation hit both sides at once. Their fight was meaningless in the face of the river's raw power. A cry of alarm went up. Men from both sides scrambled back from the water's edge, their animosity momentarily forgotten in the face of a common, more powerful enemy. They were trapped. The bridge was gone, and the river was a raging, impassable torrent. And then, another sound carried over the roar of the water. It was faint at first, a high, mournful cry from far down the valley, a sound that did not belong to the natural world. It grew louder, more insistent, a metallic shriek that cut through the night. A train whistle. Harlan and Mara exchanged a look of cold, dawning horror. The sound was coming from the direction of the new tracks, the tracks Judge Romley had forbidden them to work on. The railroad was not just defying the injunction. They were flaunting their defiance. They were running a train. The sound was not a signal. It was a declaration of conquest, an iron beast roaring its victory in the heart of their valley. The fight on the riverbank was just a skirmish. The real invasion had already begun. The train whistle was no longer a distant cry. It was a physical assault, a screaming harbinger of an iron future that had no regard for paper laws or the lives of small people. From around the bend, a monstrous black shape emerged from the darkness. It was a test train, a powerful locomotive pushing a line of flat cars loaded with steel rails and heavy timbers. Its single headlight cut a brilliant, terrifying cone through the night, illuminating the churning river and the stunned faces of the people on its banks. At the head of the construction crew that swarmed around the tracks stood Edison Hare, the railroad director. The chaos on the riverbank was an irrelevant sideshow to him. His world was one of timetables, tonnage, and forward momentum. He had his orders directly from the main office in Santa Fe. The line had to go through. Injunction or no injunction. "Get those stakes back in the ground," Hare bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that carried even over the noise of the approaching train. "Lay the stringers for the temporary trestle. I want that engine across the river in 1 hour." His men, a rough crew of laborers who worked with the grim efficiency of an army, moved to obey. They ignored the ranchers, wading into the muddy shallows to begin pounding new stakes, their hammers ringing out a percussive rhythm of defiance against the court's authority. But then, 2 riders appeared, galloping hard from the direction of Sagebrush Bend. It was Judge Ada Romley, her face set like stone, and beside her, the elderly clerk, Milton Crane, clinging to his saddle with a look of terrified determination. They reined in their horses, the animals skittish from the noise and confusion. "Mr. Herr Judge Romley's voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of command that cut through the cacophony. She held up the official, ribbon-bound injunction. In the name of the New Mexico Territory Judiciary, I order you to cease all activity. You are in contempt of this court." Edison Hare barely gave her a glance. He pointed a thick finger at the locomotive, which was now slowing as it approached the washed-out section of track. "My orders come from Santa Fe. Judge, my company has a federal charter. This engine will cross this river tonight. You can take your piece of paper and file it with my legal department in the morning." The arrogance was breathtaking. It was a raw, naked display of power, the power of capital and industry against the power of the law. The train hissed and groaned, steam billowing from its pistons, a restless, caged beast waiting to be unleashed. The judge's authority, so absolute in the quiet courthouse, seemed to mean nothing here. In the face of this iron behemoth, the ranchers watched, helpless, their small victory turning to ash in their mouths. It was then that Mara moved. She was no longer the quiet observer, the fight on the riverbank, the kiss in the rain, the shared confession in the dark they had forged something new in her, a strength she didn't know she possessed. With a steady, determined gait, she walked past the stunned ranchers, past the railroad workers, and stepped onto the rickety, half-finished auxiliary bridge the crew had just laid. It was nothing more than a series of heavy planks laid across wooden trestles, a precarious walkway over the raging torrent. She walked to the very center of the span, positioning herself directly in the path of the locomotive. The train's headlight bathed her in a brilliant, unforgiving glare, making her a solitary, defiant figure in a halo of white light. She was not carrying the legal documents in her hand. She had tied them securely around her waist with the worn leather strap, her mother's belt, the simple knot resting against her stomach like a shield. It was her anchor, not just to her past, but to this present, desperate moment. A collective gasp went through the crowd. She was a human barricade, a fragile, flesh and blood embodiment of the law against the unyielding force of the machine. Orrin Tate, who had been watching from the shadows, saw his chance. This was not about the law anymore. It was about the document, with Mara on the bridge, isolated and vulnerable. He could end this once and for all. With a savage cry, he broke from the crowd and sprinted onto the bridge. He moved with a desperate, feral speed, his face a mask of crazed determination. He lunged for her, his hands reaching not for her, but for the papers tied around her waist. "Give me that," he snarled. Harlan had anticipated the move. He was already in motion, sprinting after Tate. He reached the deputy just as Tate's fingers brushed against the documents. Harlan tackled him, his arms wrapping around Tate's waist, driving him away from Mara. The combined weight of the two men was too much for the hastily constructed bridge. There was a sharp, cracking sound, like a bone snapping. The plank beneath their feet splintered, giving way completely. For a horrifying instant, they were suspended in midair, a tangle of limbs against the bright glare of the headlight. Then they fell. They didn't fall into the main current, but slid down the sloped side of the trestle, their boots scrabbling for purchase on the slick, wet wood, carrying them inexorably toward the dark, swirling eddy that churned at the base of the bridge. Mara screamed Harlan's name. Without a second of hesitation, she acted. Her hands flew to the knot at her waist, untying it with frantic, practiced speed. The precious legal document, the reason for this entire fight, fell unheeded onto the remaining planks of the bridge. It no longer mattered. She held one end of the long leather strap, its familiar, worn texture a grounding reality in the chaos. "Harlan," she cried, her voice cutting through the roar of the river and the hiss of the train. She threw the other end of the strap down toward the two struggling men. It uncoiled in the air like a lifeline. Harlan, his face pale in the reflected light from the water, looked up. He saw the strap, and then he saw her, her face a beacon of fierce, desperate hope. He let go of Tate and grabbed the end of the leather strap. The current was pulling at his legs, trying to drag him under. He had a secure hold, but Mara was not strong enough to pull both men up. He looked at Tate, who was flailing beside him, his face a mask of pure terror as the cold, powerful waters sucked at him. In that moment, there was no animosity, no hatred, only two men on the verge of being consumed by the river. Harlan made a choice. He braced his feet against a submerged beam, and, with his free hand, he grabbed the collar of Tate's shirt. "Take it," he roared at the deputy, shoving the end of the leather strap into Tate's hand. Tate's eyes widened in disbelief, but his survival instinct took over. He grabbed the strap, his knuckles white. "Pull!" Harlan yelled up at Mara. She pulled, wrapping the other end of the strap around her wrist, the leather biting into her skin. The ranchers at the edge of the bridge rushed forward to help her, their hands grabbing the strap, adding their strength to hers. They hauled the deputy from the water, dragging him, sputtering and choking, onto the relative safety of the bridge. The crowd on the riverbank, both ranchers and railroad men, stood in stunned silence. They had just witnessed an act of such unexpected, selfless grace that it transcended the bitter conflict of the night. Harlan Pike, the man Tate had tried to ruin, the man he had just tried to assault, had chosen to save his enemy first. Harlan was still in the water, clinging to a wooden support, the current tearing at him. Now it was his turn. The ranchers threw the strap back down to him, and with their combined strength, they pulled him from the river's greedy grasp. He collapsed onto the bridge, soaked and exhausted, his chest heaving. Above them all, Judge Ada Romley sat on her horse, her face grim. She had seen everything. She urged her horse forward to the very edge of the new tracks, placing herself directly in front of the still idling locomotive. She raised her hand, not with a legal document, but as a simple, absolute command to stop. "Mr. Hare," she called out, her voice now carrying the cold, hard weight of ultimate authority. "This is your final warning. That engine moves one more inch forward, and I will personally see to it that the Southwestern Pacific Railroad is charged with criminal contempt of court. I will have your assets in this territory seized. I will have you and every one of your men arrested and held without bail. You will not build another foot of track in this territory for a generation. Test me." The bluff was gone from Edison Hare's face, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He had pushed a local judge. He had not anticipated pushing a woman who was threatening to dismantle his company's entire territorial operation. He looked from her unyielding face to the silent, watching crowd, to the two men soaked and shivering on the broken bridge. He had lost control. He held up his hand, and with a final, defeated sigh, he gave the signal. There was a loud, prolonged hiss of steam as the engineer released the brakes. The massive driving wheels of the locomotive, which had been straining to move forward, gave a final, shuddering groan and fell still. The engine, the great iron beast, had been halted. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Horace Bellamy knew the fight was lost. His forgery was exposed, his enforcer was disgraced, and his corporate muscle had been legally neutered. He walked over to where Harlan was just getting to his feet, Mara at his side. He pitched his voice low, a final, desperate gamble. "Pike," he said, ignoring everyone else, "this doesn't have to be a total loss for you. The company still needs access. Just the West Bank. Sell me your section. Just yours. I'm authorized to offer you double what I offered the others. Cash. Tonight. You and the girl can be a long way from here by morning." It was the ultimate temptation, a fortune and escape, an easy end to the fight. Harlan didn't even look at the money man. His gaze was on Mara. He saw her standing there, her hair a wild tangle, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw from pulling the strap. And he saw the most beautiful, courageous thing he had ever seen in his life. He saw his harbor. He saw his home. He turned his eyes back to Bellamy, and his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. "This land holds the water for everyone. Bellamy, it's not mine to sell. He looked back at Mara, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his tired, grateful eyes. "Besides," he said softly, his words meant only for her, "I already have what I want to keep." The dawn that broke over Sagebrush Bend was a quiet miracle. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and shining. The sun rose into a sky of pale, translucent blue, and its light fell upon a valley transformed. The bitter willow, which had been a raging, muddy beast the night before, now flowed full and deep, but with a serene and placid grace. Its surface was a perfect, unbroken mirror, reflecting the wooden roofs of the town, the stony face of Ash Mesa, and the vast, peaceful sky. The air itself felt different. It was cool and clean, washed free of dust and greed, smelling of wet sagebrush and new beginnings. Justice, like the morning, arrived quietly but with an undeniable authority. Judge Ada Romley, her face etched with a weary resolve, stood on the steps of the makeshift town hall and formally served the warrants. Horace Bellamy, his fine suit now a ruined mess of mud and humiliation, accepted his with a look of numb disbelief. Orrin Tate, his swagger gone, replaced by a sullen, hollow-eyed defeat, was stripped of his badge. The territorial marshals, summoned by the judge, led them away, their departure marking a quiet, decisive end to the reign of fear and deception. In the aftermath, Dahlia Voss could be seen methodically changing the lock on the front door of the lantern room, a simple, practical act that felt like a profound ritual of purification, securing her establishment not just against intruders, but against the ghosts of the past. Later that morning, a small group of ranchers, led by Old Man Jensen, gathered by the river. They did not carry shovels or weapons, but a single, newly painted wooden sign. They hammered it deep into the riverbank, its fresh white paint a stark and beautiful contrast against the rich, dark earth. The black letters, painted with care, were simple and direct: Bitter Willow Basin, communal water not for sale, by order of the community. It was more than a sign. It was a testament, a declaration of independence, a promise they were making not just to the world, but to each other. They had arrived as a collection of individuals and had emerged as a community. Harlan and Mara watched this from a distance, standing near the broken remnants of the temporary bridge. The legal documents, which had been the catalyst for so much chaos, lay on a dry rock where Mara had left them, their pages slightly warped from the damp night air. Harlan walked over and picked them up. The worn leather strap, her mother's belt, was still tied around them, caked with the mud of the riverbank. He did not untie it. Instead, he carried the bundle down to the water's edge. He knelt, dipping the strap into the clear, cool current, and with a gentle, almost reverent touch, he washed the mud away. He worked the leather in his hands, his rough fingers surprisingly tender, until it was clean. He dried it carefully on his sleeve and walked back to where Mara stood waiting. He held it out to her, placing the familiar, braided strap into her open palm. It was her anchor, and he was returning it to her. She looked down at the leather, then up at his face. The sun was warm on her skin, and in his eyes, she saw not the desolate emptiness of the desert, but the calm, deep promise of a harbor. A smile touched her lips, a smile that trembled with the weight of all the years of loneliness and all the hope of the years to come. "Make me yours," she said, her voice a soft, clear whisper that was almost lost in the gentle murmur of the river. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and a deep, dawning comprehension. She took a small step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "I've held on to this strap for too long," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "It was all I had to keep from being washed away, but I don't want to just hold on anymore. Harlan, I want to arrive." He understood. He understood everything. This was not a plea for ownership, but a prayer for belonging. This was a final, courageous act of letting go, of trusting that he would be the shore she had been searching for. He took the strap from her hand, but he did not put it in his pocket or toss it aside. Instead, he stepped behind her, and she felt his presence, solid and warm and real, with slow, deliberate movements. He circled the leather strap around her waist. He did not pull it tight, as one would a belt meant to bind or restrain. He let it rest there gently, a loose, warm embrace, a silent vow that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with protection. He brought the ends together at her side and, instead of tying the familiar, hard knot of her past, his fingers worked a new, softer knot, one that could be easily undone. It was not a tether. It was a promise of a new kind of connection, one based not on the desperate need to hold on, but on the free and gentle choice to stay. She leaned back against him, a soft sigh escaping her lips, a sound of profound and peaceful surrender. They stood like that for a long time, watching the river flow, two solitary souls who had finally found their confluence. Later, they walked back to his ranch, to the barn that had twice been their sanctuary. He saddled Sparrow, the graceful mare who had carried her through the terrifying night. The old saddle on its stand, his father's saddle, seemed to watch them, a silent, approving ancestor. Harlan mounted first, then reached down a hand for Mara. She took it without hesitation, and he pulled her up to sit in front of him. It was an easy, natural fit. They rode out from the ranch, not toward the town or the open plains, but along the now peaceful edge of the bitter willow. The water lapped gently at the shore, and the sunlight sparkled on its surface. For the first time, a sound that had been absent from both their lives for too long filled the quiet air: laughter. It started with Mara, a soft, bubbling sound of pure, unburdened joy. Then Harlan joined in, his own laughter a deep, rusty rumble, the sound of a long-frozen spring finally thawing and beginning to flow. Their shared laughter mingled with the sound of the water and the whisper of the dry wind, a new kind of music for the valley. As they rounded a bend, they looked across to the opposite bank. A few of Bellamy's red survey stakes, the ones the ranchers hadn't reached, were still standing, but their defiance was gone. The river, in its gentle, inexorable rise, had softened the earth around them. As they watched, one of the stakes leaned, hesitated, and then toppled over with a soft splash, its angry red tip disappearing into the clear, brown water. The future, which had once been a threatening line carved into the dirt, was now open and undefined, as vast and full of promise as the grasslands after a long, healing rain. Their love, they both knew, would no longer be a thing held together by a fragile leather strap, an anchor against loneliness. It would be a choice, made fresh every morning with the rising of the sun, as real and as vital as the water that now flowed, free and clear, through the heart of their land. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.